The room is quiet, but imagine the sound of a blade dragged across stone, sharpened for a purpose you would rather not think about. Now picture it not aimed at the throat or the wrist, but at the part of the body that defines life, lineage, and pride. Castration. A single word that carries centuries of dread. Across empires and cultures, it was never just surgery. It was punishment, humiliation, sacrifice. A way to strip men of power and turn them into tools, whether for labour, devotion, or the service of kings. You may know the surface, the eunuchs in palaces, the crude cuts of primitive times, but history hides methods far stranger and far more brutal than most dare to imagine. This is not just a story of blades and blood. It is a descent into the darkest corners of human invention, where suffering was measured, prolonged, and sometimes even sanctified. Each method reveals not only the cruelty of the act itself, but also the chilling logic behind why it was done. And the first method might make you squirm before we even begin. Imagine a world without steel, without polished instruments, without even the faintest notion of antiseptic. In the most primitive times, castration was carried out with whatever sharp object came to hand. A jagged shard of pottery, the edge of a flint stone, or a knife hammered out of bone. There was no finesse, no mercy, only the desperate slash of a crude blade against living flesh. The act itself was as brutal as it was final. The edge, often dull from wear, tore instead of sliced. Skin split unevenly, muscle fibers snapped one by one, and blood poured freely without restraint. There was no cloth ready to bind the wound, no clean water to wash it, only earth and sweat and the muffled cries of those forced to endure. Infection was not a possibility, it was an inevitability. Insects buzzed close, the smell of iron and rot thickening in the air within hours. Survival was rare, and when it occurred it came at a cost of lifelong agony. To those who performed it, however, survival was secondary. In some cultures, the purpose was punishment, the stripping away of masculinity as retribution for crimes or betrayal. To others, it was ritual sacrifice, the offering of virility itself to appease unseen gods. And for those marked for slavery, it was a practical cruelty, ensuring that men could be controlled, made incapable of leaving behind heirs or claims to freedom. The victims' screams were not just sounds of pain, but declarations of helplessness, echoing in courtyards, temples, and battle camps. It was a spectacle as much as it was an execution of power. The crude blade did not only wound the body, it carved away identity, reducing a man to something less in the eyes of his captors. When we imagine primitive tools, we might hope they implied clumsiness, an unskilled attempt at domination. But the truth was sharper than that. These crude implements were chosen not despite their brutality, but because of it. Pain and terror were part of the design. To bleed, to suffer, to linger in the haze between life and death, this was the intended message. As barbaric as this sounds, it was only the beginning. The crude blade was raw, direct, and often fatal. But the methods that followed were devised not merely to mutilate, but to calculate. They aimed not only to remove, but to prolong suffering. And the next step in this descent shows how cruelty turned to innovation. If the crude blade was chaos, crushing was calculation. Where jagged stones and shards relied on sudden violence, this method relied on pressure, on the slow extinguishing of life within the flesh. Imagine two heavy stones pressed together, trapping what once defined a man between them. The weight increased, the skin whitened, and then the sound like twigs snapping underfoot as tissue gave way. Crushing had its own grim logic. Rather than slicing, the organs were destroyed by force, blood flow cut off until the tissue withered and died. It was slower, sometimes agonizingly so, but in a cruel sense more controlled. A clamp made of wood or iron could be fastened tightly, locking down with a grip that allowed no escape. Hours or even days later, the tissue turned black, lifeless, and eventually fell away. What began as suffocating pressure ended in decay. The pain was exquisite in its intensity. Swelling ballooned the flesh, every nerve screaming as circulation collapsed. The body betrayed itself, fever rising, pus seeping, infection creeping from within. Sometimes, death came quickly from shock. Other times, survival dragged on for weeks, each moment marked by throbbing agony and the stench of rotting tissue. To endure this was not merely punishment, it was transformation into a living warning for others. Cultures that used crushing saw it as both punishment and deterrent. Soldiers captured in war could be mutilated this way to rob them of future generations. Criminals faced the clamp as a spectacle of shame, and in some twisted interpretations of ritual purity, the slow destruction was seen as more fitting than the swift cut of a blade, to remove not just the flesh but the dignity of dying quickly. Picture the moment of silence that follows a clamp's tightening. No sharp cry, no immediate spray of blood. Just the grinding weight, the suffocating numbness, and the slow realization of what had been taken. If the crude blade was a storm, crushing was suffocation. The victim was forced to feel the life leave his body piece by piece. But as cruel as this was, it left something behind. Infection, fever, lingering death. Not all who performed castration wanted their victims to linger. Some wanted it swift, final, and spectacular. And so, fire was brought into the equation not just to destroy, but to cauterize, to burn away the flesh in a single searing moment. Flame has always fascinated humanity. It purifies, it destroys, it leaves nothing untouched. When turned upon the human body in the act of castration, fire became both weapon and cure. It was not enough to cut. It had to burn. Imagine the iron tongs pulled from a bed of coals, their tips glowing orange, hissing with heat. The victim is restrained, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke. There is no sudden slash, no drawn-out pressure. Instead, the searing kiss of molten metal pressed down upon the most vulnerable flesh. The organs did not simply fall away, they charred, blackened, and shriveled in an instant. The hiss of fat melting, the crackle of skin crisping, the scream that pierced the silence, these sounds became ritual as much as punishment. The cruel efficiency of fire served two purposes. First, it destroyed beyond repair, leaving no possibility of regrowth or reversal. Second, it sealed its own wound. The cauterization stopped blood loss, allowing more victims to survive the mutilation. Survival was not mercy. It was intention. Eunuchs in imperial courts, slaves for powerful masters, or prisoners punished publicly could endure precisely because fire left them alive to serve or to suffer. But fire was more than a tool, it was a spectacle. In marketplaces and temples, men were branded and burned before crowds. Flames were seen as holy, cleansing, burning away not just flesh but sin. In some cultures, castration by fire was framed as ritual purification, a brutal offering that merged the physical with the spiritual. The sensory details are impossible to ignore. The smoke clinging to the air, the suffocating stench of cooked flesh, the metallic tang that filled the throat of every witness. Even those who watched could not escape it. The victim's body convulsed, but the heat left him with no strength to struggle for long. What remained was silence, and the lingering odour of something that should never have been burned. For all its horror, fire also represented refinement compared to stone and clamp. It was cleaner, faster, and in its own grim way, more successful. But where fire brought speed, others sought precision. Blades were forged not crudely, not improvised, but designed specifically for castration, and in the grand empires of history, these knives created entire classes of men who lived and died under their edge. By the time empires rose across Asia and the Middle East, castration had become more than punishment. It was a system, and with systems came refinement, no longer the crude stone, the crushing clamp, or the searing iron. Instead, there was the eunuch's knife, a blade designed with singular purpose, honed by practice, and wielded by men whose livelihoods depended on the removal of another's manhood. In imperial China, in the Ottoman palaces, and beyond, eunuchs were not anomalies. They were institutions, men reshaped by steel, placed in the most intimate corridors of power. They served emperors, sultans, queens, and courts because their altered bodies rendered them both useful and safe. But behind the gilded doors of their influence lay the ritual of their making. The blade, the basin, the silence before the cut. The eunuch's knife was not always large. In fact, it was often small, sharp, and efficient, meant to sever swiftly. Yet what was removed varied by region and era. In some cases, only the testes. In others, the entire organ, leaving nothing but scarred flesh. The choice was not mercy, but design ensuring obedience, eliminating temptation, or signalling status. The man who performed the act was not a butcher, but a professional. Some eunuch makers passed their skills across generations. Their expertise whispered in hidden chambers. For the victim, the terror began long before the blade touched skin. The knowledge that his future, his identity, his very sense of self would be cut away was as heavy as the knife itself. Some were children, handed over by families seeking status through palace service. Others were prisoners, captured and reshaped to serve a foreign throne. A few even chose the knife themselves, believing it a path to influence, wealth, or survival. The procedure, however, was far from clean. Even in skilled hands, blood pooled quickly, searing pain shot through the body, and fever often followed. Death hovered near. Survivors bore not only scars but permanent reminders, voices that never deepened, bodies that never fully matured, and lives forever marked by their enforced transformation. And yet, many rose to wield immense political power, whispering in the ears of emperors, shaping dynasties from the shadows. But as refined as the eunuch's knife may seem compared to fire or stone, not all societies sought such precision. Some turned to the unlikeliest of weapons, not forged steel but substances that corroded and consumed. The next method left no blade marks at all, only the slow burn of chemicals that devoured flesh from within. Chemistry, when turned toward cruelty, is a slow betrayal. Unlike the blade that severs or the flame that sears, corrosive castration worked from the inside out. It was invisible at first. A touch, a smear, a forced drink. Then the body remembered the offense in acids, in alkalis, in compounds that eat tissue and dissolve identity with a patience more horrifying than any immediate blow. Imagine a quiet courtyard where an accused man kneels, offered a cup. It glints in the sunday. He drinks because refusal is a refusal of survival. At first, there is only a bitter, metallic taste, a tickle at the throat. Then the mouth burns. Then the esophagus. The poison travels. It lodges. Within hours, the scrotum swells and reddens, the skin blistering like paper pushed too close to a candle. Pain becomes a living geography, mapped in fire and rawness, each nerve a road rerouted into agony. Other accounts were more direct. Lime mixed with water forms a paste that will not merely blister but corrode. Applied to the flesh and bound tight, it eats the skin, the soft tissues, the membranes. Flesh sloughs in ragged sheets. The victims, strapped down, could only watch as material they trusted turned traitor. The scent was not iron now, but a chemical sting, acrid and clean, that clung to the air like a memory you could not unlearn. Infection followed as a companion, turning a local wound into systemic ruin. Poison and corrosives had pragmatic appeal to those who used them. They required no skillful knife man, no heated iron, no heavy clamp, a bottle, a mortar, a greedy hand. In the hands of torturers, chemistry became precise. Less spectacle, more inevitability. The act could be hidden behind the polite language of treatment or purification. A man might be taken under the pretense of care and return altered, his body failing where it was most intimate. The psychological cruelty was particular. With a blade, the horror is acute. With corrosives, the horror is anticipatory. You could not cleanly watch the moment a corrosive did its work. You waited as slow necrosis unfolded. You listened to the patient curse and plead. You watched appetite vanish. You watched a man once proud of offspring and lineage become a husk. His identity eroded day by something unseen at first and then brutally obvious. Legal and ritual contexts varied. In some courts, corrosives were punishment for betrayal or rape, a sentence designed to disgrace quietly, to ruin fertility without public execution. In cultic settings, corrosives might be framed as a purification through consumption, a sacrament that strips away desire. And in darker corners of slave markets or prisons, corrosives were tools of asset control. A master could ensure compliance without the mess of blood. Survivors faced mutilation that was mercilessly uncompromising. Scars remained as maps of chemical warfare. Sexual function and reproductive capability dissolved. Pain could persist for years. The body's tissues remembered the betrayal, and memory anchored itself in the flesh. Yet the chemical path, grisly as it was not the pinnacle of mechanical ingenuity. Some societies engineered devices designed to remove masculinity, with a cold efficiency that made the hands of torturers redundant. Machines were born from bureaucracies and militaries, from the same logic that inventories people as property. The next methods would not rely on poison or flame alone, but on crafted instruments that turn mutilation into procedure. Machines change cruelty. They take improvisation and ritual and make them procedural. In some places, the same mind that engineered siege engines and waterworks turned its attention to bodies. Castration devices were born from that impulse. Remove the human variability, standardize the act, and make suffering efficient. Imagine a tool like a carpenter's vice repurposed for anatomy. 2 iron jaws, ridged and merciless, close around flesh until all blood is strangled from a limb. Some devices were crude clamps with threaded rods, tightened by wrench until tissue blanched and blackened. Others resembled primitive saws or guillotines designed to sever with a single mechanical motion. There were screw-driven contraptions that squeezed and cut simultaneously, ratchets that allowed the operator to increase pressure in tiny, deliberate increments. The sound was not a scream alone, but a workspace sound. Metal turning, the click of gears, the scrape of teeth meeting flesh. The logic was administrative. Armies needed rapid, repeatable methods. Slave traders required assurance. Courts demanded consistency in sentencing. A device could be transported, displayed, and used on dozens without the fatigue or temperament of a single torturer. It could produce uniform results, a grotesque sort of quality control. Instruments could be catalogued, stored, even engraved with the owner's mark. In some records, they are referred to with the same clinical calm as farm tools. The sensory reality was clinical and cold. There was no ceremonial fire, no dramatic plunge of a blade. Instead, there was the metallic tang on the tongue, the grinding odour of cauterized fat when devices included heated elements, the precise, almost polite rhythm of a screw tightened 1 notch at a time. Victims were bound to boards or iron frames, straps bit into skin. The machine did the rest. For observers, there was an eerie detachment. The operator could pretend he worked on wood or leather, efficiency, anaesthetized compassion. Engineered cruelty also allowed for secrecy and scale. Entire units were converted by military planners into instruments for population control. Conquerors seeking to prevent the rise of hostile lineages could process prisoners with a factory-like steadiness. Harem keepers used smaller versions when they needed to convert men quickly for service. In some accounts, devices were used in mass, the clang of iron keeping time with the ambitions of the powerful. But the apparent precision did not mean less suffering. Mechanical removal could be more thorough, and leave behind complications machines did not reckon. Crushed nerves that became phantom pain, jagged remnants that festered, hidden fragments that later required further surgeries to remove. A device that promised predictability often produced a different sort of unpredictability. Chronic infection, ruined tissues, and a lifetime of grinding pain under skin that no longer behaved as it should. There was also a psychological terror unique to machinery. To face a blade is to face a person. To face a device is to face an apparatus that implies a system. It declares that the harm you suffer is not the whim of an individual but the policy of an institution. That realization hollowed men in a different way. Their mutilation was not merely personal, it was bureaucratic. Some of these instruments were displayed like trophies. Others were passed down within households or offices, their teeth oiled, their screws greased, their history whispered. They made the act of castration less a moment of emotion, and more a measured procedure, a problem solved on a ledger. And yet, for all their iron precision, mechanical devices were not the end of the story. The penultimate cruelty still gave way to something more haunting. The final method was wrapped not in gears and bolts, but in faith and meaning. What came next combined devotion with mutilation in a way that rewrote the boundaries between choice and coercion. The knife cuts deep, but belief cuts deeper. In some cultures, castration was not forced by conquerors or inflicted as punishment. It was embraced, demanded, celebrated as an act of devotion. Here, mutilation became ritual. The body was not only broken, it was offered. Picture a torchlit chamber, walls ringing with chants, drums echoing like a heartbeat. The initiate steps forward, trembling, not because he is bound, but because he has chosen. Before him, an altar draped in cloth, sacred knives gleaming in the firelight. The air is thick with incense, smoke stinging the eyes, masking the metallic tang soon to come. Followers watch in silence, some swaying, some murmuring prayers. They believe this act strips away earthly desire, remakes the body into a vessel for purity or service. The cut is made not in secrecy but in spectacle. In certain cults, men castrated themselves publicly, a frenzy of blood and devotion spilling onto temple steps. The sight was both horrifying and revered. Blood stained the ground, but to the faithful it was consecration, not shame. The screams mingled with hymns, suffering recast as sacred offering. Where others saw mutilation, these sects saw transcendence. Not all ritual castrations were voluntary. In fanatical groups, initiates were pressured, convinced, or compelled. To refuse was to reject the gods. To submit was to claim a place among the chosen. Whether coerced or willing, the outcome was the same: a body forever altered in the name of belief. The psychological weight of ritualized castration was immense. Unlike the clamp or the burning iron, the knife here cut through more than flesh. It severed ties to family, to reproduction, to worldly ambition. A man's identity was stripped down to devotion alone. The scar was not only physical but symbolic, a permanent mark of separation from the rest of humanity. To modern eyes, the imagery is almost unbearable. The chanting, the smoke, the gleaming blade raised above trembling hands. And yet, for centuries, these rites held meaning powerful enough to drive men to mutilate themselves willingly. That willingness is perhaps more haunting than the brutality of any clamp or flame. It shows not only how inventive humanity can be in cruelty, but how belief can make cruelty sacred. And yet, what does it say about humanity that so many civilizations found meaning in this? Castration is not just the story of flesh removed, it is the story of power written upon the body. Across empires and centuries, it was used to control bloodlines, to punish enemies, to create servants who could never threaten dynasties. From crude blades to sacred altars, each method reflected not only cruelty but the desires of those in power. What drives humanity to invent such forms of suffering? Is it fear of rebellion? Is it obsession with purity? Or is it the darker impulse to dominate so completely that even the most intimate parts of life are no longer one's own? Every method, no matter how primitive or precise, carried the same message. The body is not yours, it belongs to the will of another. And though the flames and knives may have faded, the urge to control has not vanished. Today, echoes remain in medical and chemical castration, framed in the language of treatment, punishment, or reform. The tools are cleaner, the settings clinical, but the principle is familiar. Power still seeks to shape the body, to dictate what desire and identity should be. The history of castration lingers as both horror and warning. It shows how easily pain can be dressed as justice, as devotion, as necessity, and how quickly humanity will build tools not only to kill, but to carve away what makes us who we are. In the end, the blades and fires may have faded, but the urge to control the body has never truly disappeared. If this history unsettled you, it is only a glimpse into darker corners still waiting. If you thought this was disturbing, you haven't seen what comes next.